Welcome to this event in the Dublin Book Festival in collaboration with the RDS Library Speaker Series. My name is Marie Coleman and I'm a Professor of Irish History here at Queen's University in Belfast. And I'm joined today by three authors of fascinating new insights into the Irish Revolutionary period, with particular focus on the contentious year of 1922 and the start of the Irish Civil War. We're joined today by Dr. Hilary Dully, who's a documentary filmmaker based in East Clare, whose career to date has covered a number of fascinating topics, including access to abortions. And more recently, she's been focusing on the life in rural Ireland and I suppose gaining the insights of the older generation in rural Ireland about traditions and ways of life in rural Ireland, which have been passing out of out of tradition now as the older generation moves on. So it's important to capture that interest, and we look forward to hearing more about that. But Hilary's here today to talk to us about a memoir which she has edited recently. And the memoir was written by a family connection, I believe, Maura Comerford. So she'll tell us a bit about that in a few minutes. We're also joined by Professor Diarmaid Ferriter, Professor of Modern Irish History at University College Dublin, and a well-known commentator in media. We're familiar with Diarmaid, particularly from his weekly column in the Irish Times, but also his most recent book, which people may have seen, is called Between Two Hells. It's a new history of the Irish Civil War, and it's just been published by Profile Books. And our third speaker then, Dr. Caoimhe Nic Dháibhéad from the School of History in the University of Sheffield. Caoimhe is a graduate of UCC and Queen's University Belfast, and is the author of a number of books on the Irish Revolutionary period and on modern Irish history, including a biography of Sean MacBride. And more recently, she's delving into an interesting new theme in Irish Revolutionary studies, which is the history of emotions in the Revolution. And she has an essay in that on the third book we are discussing here today, which is published by the Royal Irish Academy, and it's called Ireland 1922, Independence, Partition and Civil War. And that's edited by Fergal McGarry and Dara Gannon. So I thought we might just start by asking the authors to give a brief summary of the books. So Hilary, I suppose for the benefit of our audience, could you tell us a bit about who Maura Comerford was and a sense of what is contained in her memoir, which goes with the fascinating title of On Dangerous Ground?
Well, Maura Comerford was born in 1893 in Wicklow, but she spent most of her formative years in County Wexford, living, I suppose, on the fringes of the gentry because their circumstances were not as good as they could have been financially. But she became politicized, I suppose, during the period 1910 onwards, and she became involved, joined Commemoration, was very active during the War of Independence because she moved to Dublin and lived with the renowned historian Alice Stopford Green as her secretary. And then she took the Republican side in the Civil War and again was very active. And as Margaret Ward points out in the introduction, she was unusual in the sense that she was all over the country. And then finally, at the end of the Civil War, she was sent by De Valera to America and then returned, I suppose, to a pretty dismal, poverty-stricken life for a number of years. And then she finally became women's editor in the Irish Press. And when she retired from the Irish Press, she began to write her memoir of the revolutionary period, and also, I suppose, the lead up to it, which is as interesting in many ways because it explains a lot about Ireland at that time. And she lived a very long life, remained a very strong Republican, and remained very interested in Republican affairs, and had quite a big public profile until her death, when she was given a Republican funeral. So that, I suppose, kind of sums up in short her life.
And I understand this book has a very personal significance for you, that you have a family connection to Maura Comerford, whose fascinating life you've just detailed there for us.
Yes, my husband was her nephew. So when she died, he became the custodian of her archive, because she's a very extensive archive going from 1916 up until her death. And also, I began to read her memoir very early on, but it was only when I began to go through the archive I realised that the memoir, which was in and still is in the UCD archives, wasn't in any way complete. She had a lot of additional chapters. And so I began the process, I suppose, in about 2016 of getting all the material together and then trying to, I suppose, look at it from a chronological point of view, and also to try and tell the wider story as well as telling her story. That's basically how it came about.
And Diarmaid, then your new book, Between Two Hells, is really the first full-length study of the Irish Civil War on a national level since the publication of Michael Hopkinson's Green Against Green in 1988. We've had some very good regional studies. We have, for example, 2 studies of the Civil War in Dublin City, and then, of course, the more recent county series being produced by Lilliput Press, which has probably up to about 10 of them published at this point. All of those have a chapter on the Civil War. But it's over 30 years now since we've had something like this, a good full-length study of the Civil War. Since Hopkinson published his and now yours has come along, what do you think has changed? What are the new themes? What's different about the way you writing about the Civil War now in the 21st century, how you would approach it, say, to the way previous historians approached it?
Well, Michael Hopkinson's book in 1988 was a very considerable achievement, given the range of material that was available to him and other historians at that time. It was quite limited, but I mean, he did a very fine job in being able to describe what he termed a chaotic civil war with an ill-defined beginning and an ill-defined end. And he really dug deep into the military strategies and the military progress, I suppose, of the conflict. I was coming at it from a different perspective, because what I was interested in was more of the texture, I suppose. And it's interesting that we're talking about emotions as well today. How did it feel to live through this, and what was it like to deal with the aftermath and the legacy? And what I was seeking to do was make use of archival material that wasn't available to Hopkinson in 1988. And whether that's the private papers of individuals who were involved in it, men and women, or the massive military service pensions archive, which has been released in phases in recent years. These are the files that cover the applications of men and women who applied for pensions based on their activities in the decade 1913 to 1923. And there's an awful lot of Civil War material within that. But also you get an awful lot of information on their afterlives, the detritus of the Civil War era. How do they cope with the aftermath? So it becomes a very important archive for social history, for medical history. And you get all sorts of perspectives that just were not available to scholars in the 1980s and the 1990s. And, that sense of living with the burden of the Civil War, but also that sense of it as a lottery. Those who survived, some thrived in its aftermath. Some had to deal with the reality that the promises and the aspirations of that revolutionary generation did not materialize, and that was very difficult for people. So what I was trying to do in the book was describe the course and nature of the war in the first half, and then in the second half to look at the variety of different ways in which the legacy played out for individuals. And when I say individuals, I'm not talking about household names, though of course they feature. I was more interested in the men and women who are not part of are not well-known individuals when it comes to this era, but who had to deal with what for them were really existential questions.
Yeah, and Caoimhe, I suppose, similarly to comparing Diarmaid's book with previous works on it, I was struck as well looking at even the title of the compendium produced by the Royal Irish Academy and the use of the year 1922 as the title. And I was reminded of Tom Garvin's previous work, which also has that title, 1922. And of course was more focused on state building and the importance of 1922 in the formation of the Irish Free State. But I think it's fair to say that the Academic Compendium throws a much broader light on a wider range of aspects to life in Ireland in 1922. Would that be a fair summary, do you think, of that book?
Yeah, absolutely. Although I'm not one of the editors, it's edited by Dara Gannon and Fergal McGarry. I've been able to see the book, which will be out early in next year in 2022, and it comprises 52 or so short essays addressing a range of different themes. So what you end up with is a kaleidoscopic view of that year when Ireland went from the immediate aftermath of the treaty split all the way through to civil war, and a real darkening of the horizons by December 1922 when we've had the first wave of civil war executions. And the editors brought together all these different scholars who approached that year from a number of different perspectives. And here we can see the new directions and the new agendas that have emerged really in the last 10, 15 years or so in how we write about the Irish Revolution. And this chimes with some of Diarmaid's approach in his book. We do have a stronger emphasis on cultural history of the revolution. There are chapters on the history of emotions, the history of trauma, the more kind of normative cultural sphere, the history of music, film, sport, and literature, and really trying to get to a history of everyday life. So for people who weren't involved, who weren't members of the IRA or Cumann na mBan or the National Army, how did they experience that year in 1922? And for many people, I'm thinking of Lindsay Erner Burns' essay writing about a woman's experience of poverty in 1922. The great themes of her life remained quite unchanged. How was she going to feed her family? How was she going to keep a roof over their heads? So while you have all of this upheaval and a slide into violence at the level of the activists and the revolutionaries, you have the kind of bread and butter basic issues that continue for ordinary people. But another big theme in the book is an emphasis on global history. So there are a number of chapters which look at events in the Irish diaspora in particular, and draws connections between those events to events back in Ireland. So the history of the Irish diaspora with the history of what was going on back at home. And in many cases, also connecting the Irish struggle to what was a broader, radical, anti-imperialist set of campaigns. And there's some really interesting chapters which look at radical solidarity in among African American groups. We see some of the kind of internecine politics of Irish American support groups that all of those groups also have to confront, the reality of the split, where support lies, who they're going to throw their weight behind, are they going to take sides in the end? So the global story of 1922 is also a big theme in the book. And then lastly, themes of gender, which I think we'll probably come on to talk about in a bit more detail. So a focus on women's experiences as political actors in their own right, but also as victims, women who experienced violence during the Civil War, but also thinking about how norms of gender were mobilized, were transgressed, were used as weapons in the battle of rhetoric during the treaty split and during the Civil War as well. And many listeners will be familiar with Pius O'Hegarty's famous depiction of the women, the anti-treatyite women who were unsexed and in their support for the anti-treatyites. And Aidan Beattie has a really interesting chapter looking at how gender is used as a weapon in that propaganda battle. So that's another one of the themes.
Yes, I'm particularly interested by that theme of gender, and I thought we might explore it a bit more because it jumped out at me looking at the three texts as one one theme that really goes through all of them. And I suppose, Hilary, it's the more obvious point about the book you've edited being the memoir of one of the more active women in the Irish Revolution. You mentioned the introduction which Margaret Ward has written, and of course it was Margaret's Unmanageable Revolutionaries, published a number of years ago now, which really set off this now strong historiographical tradition of treating the Irish Revolution from the perspective of gender. One thing that struck me reading it was a comment made by Senya Peseta in her book on Irish nationalist women about how these women never expected to be forgotten. They had left their legacy behind in these memoirs, but for various reasons, they had never been published. So we have the Dan Greens, My Fight for Irish Freedom, and Tom Barry and all that. Here we had something like Maura Comerford's memoir sitting in her shoebox or wherever she kept the archive at home, and it was never published to the same extent. So I'm wondering, first of all, I suppose, what does the memoir, now that we have access to it, what does it tell us about some of those themes that we've raised? What does it tell us about what women actually did as activists during the revolution? So what did Maura do, say, specifically during the Civil War?
Well, first of all, just in relation to P.S. Hegarty, like Maura had a lot of issues with his depictions, and she was a very strong advocate for herself and other women. Even in, I know we'll come on to talk about pensions later, but there's a fascinating file in her archive where she's engaging with women, trying to help them to make their applications for pensions. So, I mean, during the Civil War, I mean, basically she was, and I suppose you would say she was militarily involved, and as she says herself in the memoir, more in the IRA than out of it. So, I mean, she did, she was actually in Cork in 1922 on the day that Michael Collins was shot, delivering a dispatch to a De Valera. And so she went all around the country. She was involved with the White Cross for a period of time. So she was compiling reports for the White Cross. And I mean, she was at one point later on in the Civil War, she was arrested. They were planning to do a kidnapping. I won't go into too much detail about that. She escorted De Valera, and she drove all around the country. So she was one of the Republican drivers. So she was moving weapons, she was moving papers, she was moving people. She was in the forecourts. So she was there for the entire bombardment. Then she went on at the end of the forecourts and went to the Hammond Hotel. So she was there really until the very end. And she's described by the Daily Mail as the cyclist who, was fearlessly, riding through the streets of Dublin on various different errands. So she was hugely involved. And I think one of the things that about this memoir, which was taken up by Professor David Dixon, who was involved at an early stage reading prior to publication, was that he felt that it just actually described what it was like to be a revolutionary woman during that period. And in terms of the publication, Maura tried very hard during her lifetime to have this published, and she just wasn't successful. And I'm not sure, the reasons for that exactly. I suppose it did need some editing, but also I just think the role of women at that time was just dismissed and not considered to be important.
Diarmaid, is that a point you'd take up? Because all your books, and particularly this one and the companion one on the War of Independence, you have a much more detailed focus on the role of women than, say, previous texts covering these conflicts would have had. Would you agree with Hilary there that the women's narrative has been missing for too long? And what do you think is the value of the fact that we now have access to it and can write our histories using that unique perspective?
Well, there were just so many different perspectives in relation to the experiences of women that I was able to garner from the Pensions archive. I mean, what Hilary has described there is, I think, very accurate. One of Maura's contemporaries, Sheila Humphreys, wrote or spoke about the end of the Civil War, having endured a 31-day hunger strike. And there was a flatness there. And she makes reference to these women wearing the Republic like a tattered garment around them, you know, that sense that many of their dreams and their ambitions have been destroyed and that they're now facing a very hostile culture. And you can see this in a diary entry that Liam de Rochta writes during the Civil War. He was a pro-treaty Sinn Féin TD for Cork, and he kept a very detailed diary during the Civil War. And he was reacting to the hunger strike of Mary McSweeney, which was a very high-profile event in November 1922. But he referred specifically to these women as not normal beings, that they were monomaniacs, that there's a concerted effort privately and publicly to dehumanize them and to depict them as hysterical and irrational and incapable of rational thought. But what I became very interested in were the consequences, mental and physical, of the hunger strikes. You know, when we think about people who come off hunger strikes, we probably don't think enough about the long-term damage that 20 or 30 days in hunger strike can do, mentally and physically. And people are carrying around these legacies, including the women. And that's just another burden, I suppose. But another theme that runs constantly through the archive is what constitutes active service. And you've got to remember, these pensions were being adjudicated by a male club. You know, the Army Pensions Board did not contain any women. The overseers are men. The bureaucracy is run by men. And it's not that they're all hostile to women. They're not all hostile to women. But there is an issue around what constitutes active service. There tended to be an underestimation of the risks that women endured, a tendency to believe that harbouring IRA men on the run or carrying dispatches was of a lesser degree of active service. And Nora Martin, who was very active in Commemoration in Cork, she challenges the overseers directly, telling them that they can't visualize the feelings of these women during that period, the War of Independence and the Civil War. And I think that's true. There is an underestimation. And even with trying to get a narrative established of what they did, as Hilary said there, a reluctance to publish or to be associated with these women, because they are seen as trouble. And, you know, one of the things I was trying to look at was that sense of not underestimating the depth of the sincerity. We have a tendency to think about 1922 as involving, two polar opposites on either side of the Civil War. It's never as straightforward as that. You know, we have to try and understand the depth of the convictions, but also those people who were conflicted. And it's not just about anti-treaty women. There were many women who were involved, of course, in supporting the treaty, who we often don't hear enough about, but also the extent to which women were involved in propaganda. And propaganda is an intrinsic part, of course, of the Civil War. And women excelled at that and took a very leading role in it.
And I would just like to add that I agree with everything Hilary and Diarmaid have said. And I think it's interesting thinking about, Diarmaid has raised the question of what constitutes active service. And of course, one of the features of the Civil War period that's quite different to the War of Independence is the number of women who are imprisoned. It's a massive increase. And they're imprisoned precisely because the Free State authorities know that they are an intrinsic, essential part of the Republican network, that Republican network cannot function in terms of providing safe houses, as Diarmaid said, of propagandizing, of passing information securely. That network cannot function without those women who are propping it up, who are constructing it. And it's much easier for Free State authorities, of course, to identify the women. They know who they are for the most part. They've been comrades working together. They've been close associates. They know where they live. They know who their associates are. And, you know, the women are targeted but long before, you know, the kind of notional start of the Civil War in, let's say, you know, the end of June 1922. The raids on women's houses has begun before that. And there are many women, including women who are closely associated with the Easter Rising. And that's another feature perhaps that we might come on to talk about. But women like Anya Kant, for example, who says that the raids by Free State soldiers are far worse in their level of destruction than anything she had experienced at the hands of the Blackened Hands. You know, they're ripping up papers, they're deliberately, as she saw, deliberately destroying personal effects and precious items that had belonged to her husband. And it enrages her, but it also secures her, I think, in her conviction that she is fighting the same fight that her husband fought. And, you know, the enemy might have changed, but the cause is still the same.
Just to add to that very briefly, Marie, I mean, one of the other interesting themes there is emigration. And how many of those Republican women left the state. And again, that involves an awful lot of very intense local studies. But in the part of Kerry that I was looking at, because my ancestors are from there in West Kerry, there were 257 recorded members of Cumann in that part, West Kerry. And 106 of those 257 were overseas by the 1930s, which is a really striking statistic.
Mm-hmm. I was interested there by a couple of phrases you used. I mean, Diarmaid, you talked about the women being painted as hysterical, and you talked about the female, the woman giving the references there, explaining to the assessors that they couldn't possibly understand the feelings of the women. So, Caoimhe, that I think brings us neatly to the theme of your own essay in the collection on the history of emotions. Mm-hmm. Now, this is very much an evolving, a very new and exciting area of study within Irish history generally, but I think within the history of the revolution. So I wonder, could you just give us a sense of what exactly, as a historian of emotions, what sort of emotions are you studying? What sort of emotional responses to revolutionary activity are you finding for both men and women? And is there a difference? Does gender explain different emotional responses?
Well, that's a good question. And my essay in the book looked specifically at the treaty debates in Earlsfort Terrace in December and January 1922, and those were sort of characterised, I think, by P.S. O'Hegarty and others as being sort of the occasion when those female TDs revealed themselves to be driven completely by their emotions, irrational, hysterical, all those words that we've talked about. But if you look at the text of those debates, emotion runs all across the spectrum. From almost every speaker, they're a kind of a pressure cooker atmosphere. It's a closed space. Only a small proportion of the debates were held in public session. Lots of them were held in private session. But you have, you know, this sense of emotions being sort of performed, I think, as rhetorical strategies by the speakers. Lots of them speak about how they are animated by love for their country, by love for their comrades, how they don't want to see the unity of the Republican movement sundered. Lots of them talk about hatred, who they hate, how much they hate England, the enemy, that sort of thing. There are moments when somebody like Eamon de Valera is overcome. He breaks down. He's not able to carry on when the treaty is carried. So I think, I mean, it was an effective rhetorical strategy for somebody like P.S. O'Hegarty to demonize those women and to, you know, delegitimize their contributions by portraying them as being driven, you know, governed entirely by their emotions. But emotional engagement and investment in the treaty debates and the performance of emotions occurs right across the spectrum, from men and from women. And actually, I would suggest possibly more from men than from women, actually. And, you know, the major speeches by somebody like Constance Markievicz, but also Kathleen Clark, those are calmly, coldly reasoned speeches that set out their ideological reason for opposing the treaty. And it's not accurate to say that they were hysterical. I mean, that is just not a word that I would apply to those speeches whatsoever. So I think that's an example of how we can understand what emotion is doing during the revolution. So it can serve a propagandizing purpose, it can serve a political purpose, it can be used as part of a rhetorical strategy. But I think it also activated, or it energized people, it drew them into revolutionary participation. And one of the things that I want to explore in my project, more widely, is thinking about how ordinary people became kind of inscribed themselves into the revolutionary movement through these moments of high emotion. So through, hearing these speeches and being moved by what the speaker said, through attending Republican funerals, perhaps at an earlier stage, or even, in August 1922 at Michael Collins' funeral. I'm interested in emotion as a vehicle of radicalization and as a way in which we can begin to understand a bit more the experience of ordinary people during the revolution. I think, there's lots of great work done on activists and revolutionaries themselves, and there is more to be said about how emotion functioned in creating a particular emotional community that constructed that unity that we've been talking about. But I do think we need to know more about the experience of ordinary people and getting beyond only thinking about them as victims. That's clearly important, and I don't want to denigrate that work. I think that's really important. But I think ordinary people participated and understood themselves as participating in the revolution in a number of different ways. And some of those paths to participation are emotional in their roots.
I'm glad to see you use that prism of emotions to help explain the extent of women's opposition to the treaty as outlined in the opposition of the 6 women TDs and my own short essay in that 1922 collection. I was trying to get behind that as well, to get behind that portrayal of the women, as Diarmaid said, as troublemakers, probably based on the fact that the majority of women, if we look at Cumann na mBan, at least as representative, were anti-treaty and then were subsequently demonized by the pro-treaty propagandists and polemicists like O'Hegarty. But it gets to, I suppose, maybe even a more basic question, which perhaps I should have started with, but now is a good time to get to it, which is the actual split itself. What is 1922 most about in Ireland? It is about the treaty split, which eventually led to the Civil War. And of course, Hilary, at the outset, when giving us that very useful and interesting summary of Maura Comerford's history during the revolution, you mentioned the fact that she herself was anti-treaty and a Republican. Do you get a sense of what the reasons for her opposition to the treaty were from reading the memoir?
Yeah, she's, apart from, I suppose, the emotional aspect, I think Maura was particularly because she was writing it a number of years later, she's very analytical about the split and goes into quite a lot of detail, also about how emotional it was and how difficult it was. But I think as well, just the idea of the pact and trying to bring people together over a period of time and, working very hard, lots of people working very hard to avoid this happening. And I think the reason, I think she was just a Republican. She was ideologically driven. She believed in the Republican ideals. And she could see that there was a whole new set of people, set of principles coming into Irish politics, which was changing the course which they all thought that they were on together. And I think her book also engages very much with the sense of unity of purpose that there was during the War of Independence. People, all kinds of different people who wouldn't normally meet, wouldn't normally come together, all working together in this one cause. And I suppose there's some inevitability about the fact that even though they were all working for the one cause, they weren't all of the same persuasion. So those differences began to emerge. And she plots that in her memoir, exactly how that happened and how that came about. And she's very engaged with what happened at that time.
There's an interesting exchange between Michael Collins and an American journalist during the War of Independence, when Collins says, none of us have ever defined a republic. And what he was talking about was that sense that they saw themselves as separatists. They were not necessarily focused on what a republic might mean or what form a republic would involve. And then De Valera, at a later stage in the summer of 1921, seemed to be trying to generate a bit of wriggle room. And he said, we're not Republican doctrinaires as such. Now, Mary McSweeney was adamant that she was a Republican doctrinaire, and she explained why. So there were those who saw themselves in those terms. But there are a lot of people who are wavering. And Hilary's right. There are a lot of efforts to try and bring the two sides together. Jimmy Wren did a study of the GPO garrison from 1916 of 572 recorded people in the GPO during Easter week. 41% of them were neutral during the Civil War. It's a very high proportion. They opted out. And many did opt out. And the title of my book is taken, Between Two Hells, is taken from a Dáil contribution by P.J. Maloney, who was a Sinn Féin TD in Tipperary. And one of the things he said during the treaty debate is, I'm an ordinary man, I'm not an orator, I'm not a statesman. I need leadership, I need guidance. You know, people were looking for leadership and guidance. And we can focus obviously on failures of leadership. But again, we have to understand the extent to which they were feeling things. And Frank O'Connor writes about that as well when he's interned during the Civil War. He said, I rarely thought, I felt, that sense that they were feeling things and the emotions are running very strongly. But there were also those who strongly felt that this was not worth a civil war.
And of course, those Civil War divisions would last for a very long time. And I think, Diarmaid, one interesting aspect of your book, as you say, what differentiates yours from previous ones is the effort you have put into asking that question of what happened to these people afterwards. And I think, Hilary, that comes out in the subsequent history of Maura in your memoir as well. So just, Diarmaid, I suppose if we were to pick up on that theme, what stands out for you about the lives of Republican activists after the guns went silent in 1923?
Part of it is just how entrenched the class divisions become. I mean, we can look at the treaty split, and historians have examined the social and economic backgrounds of those who were involved. And, it doesn't break down on class lines, but a lot of the post-Civil War life breaks down on class lines. You may have somebody, for example, making a pension application from a tenement in Dublin who has found that his life hasn't changed very much. Sean O'Casey used to write about that as well, and he traces those themes through his plays. This is not going to make any difference to what he called the inanimate patsies in the tenements. Their lives haven't changed. And yet there were those, of course, who were able to forge very rewarding careers. So that's part of it, the gulf between those. But also, I suppose, how people come up with mental strategies to deal with trauma. I think what we're dealing with here is a history of internalized trauma. It's not something we're used to trying to tease out, I suppose. Some people can compartmentalize very effectively. Some just refuse to speak about it at all. And they were not necessarily ignoble silences. That was their way of dealing with trauma, or their way of trying to prevent a reopening of old wounds. But what strikes me, I suppose, is just the poverty that people had to endure in the midst of their trauma. And I was interested in looking at families that were split as well by the Civil War and how they fared. And like you're talking about, alcoholism and emigration and a desperate plea for a pension that might just keep them above water. I mean, we might be talking about the equivalent today of maybe €5,000 or €6,000 a year. And then you also have, the women who are confined to the lower levels of pension. So they can only qualify for grade D or E pensions. The pensions are graded from A to E. And, a lot of these are about women who eventually succeed in establishing that they might have 2.5 years service and they'd be entitled to a pension of 22 pounds per annum, a couple of €1,000 today. So, you know, it's not going to make these people in any way wealthy or even comfortable. But for others, it's about a recognition. You know, they want to be afforded the status of having made a contribution. And, you know, for some, that goes right to their core, because this was the period of their lives that they gave their all. They were very young, most of them. But that sense of 1922 and what was involved stayed with them for decades afterwards. And this is the great value of the pension archive, I suppose, that you can trace their entire lives. And, you know, one of the women I was looking at there recently, you can trace her change of addresses over the course of her long life. She lived until the 1970s, and yet she's writing mostly from England. She wants to come back to Ireland, but Ireland didn't afford her a future after 1922, and she feels betrayed. And I mean, that recurrent theme of betrayal, but also the physical disintegration. I'm really struck by how often the phrase "a complete wreck" is used in relation to men and women.
Mm-hmm. The collection there Diarmaid is referring to, of course, is the military service pensions collection, which is being released by the Department of Defence under its military archives wing. And I think we owe a great debt to the late Commandant Peter Young and to Katrina Crowe and Pat Brennan and Cecile and the team in the military archives for, I suppose, in the first case, Peter Young and Katrina ensured that this archive actually survived. And the archival team in Cahill Barracks is now making it available, and it's available digitally, so people can access material there. And of course, Hilary Maura was a recipient of a pension at that higher grade of D, reflecting her importance in the revolutionary years. But I think at the outset, you gave us an indication how things could have gone quite differently for her in the post-revolution period, having been, if you like, on the wrong side. And then it wasn't until she got the opportunity of employment with De Valera in the Irish Press, and when Republicans were entitled to get pensions after Fianna Fáil came to power in the 1930s, she got a pension. And I'm sure you're probably seeing some similarities in the importance of that pension and this financial security and the recognition it gave to her with the comments Diarmaid was making.
Yeah, I mean, Maura's life after she came back from America in 1924, because she was there for 9 months, she lived a life of acute poverty. She was loaned a piece of land in Wexford by her friend, Father Sweetman, who ran the Mount School, which was closed down at that stage. And, you know, she writes about it, you know, trying to survive, like it was an adventure to survive from week to week. And she had a decade or more of that poverty. And it was only when she got the job in the Irish Press, and it was always assumed that De Valera, although she may not have had a great attitude towards him, or I don't know what his towards her was, but he, you know, afforded her this opportunity to have a job, and that was like life-saving for her, because it meant that this acute life of poverty and disillusionment and just living, you know, having had this incredibly, I suppose, exciting on some level, very involved life in the country. She was totally marginalized. And so she had to kind of build back from that. And she was very lucky, really, to have got that opportunity. Otherwise, you know, she might never have written this memoir. She might never have, you know, been able to engage fully in public life again. So yeah, I mean, it's really interesting what Diarmaid is saying, like about, you know, how people's lives panned out. And Maura would say, you know, those who came out of, you know, the Civil War, if they came out without a private means or the ability to return to employment or get employment, that, you know, it was really, really traumatic. So yeah, I totally agree. It's and the pension archives are amazing in that respect, that you can trace what happened to people afterwards.
I suppose we could possibly be criticised so far for a bit of a partitionist outlook on our discussion, because of course the Civil War was very Southern focused. But Caoimhe, one theme that comes out quite strongly, I think, from the 1922 Royal Irish Academy book is the Ulster side of all of this. And of course, intense violence was taking place in newly created Northern Ireland in the early first half of 1922 at least. Could you tell us a bit about how the 22 book deals with the themes of what's happening in the north and around the border in this period?
Yeah, so as you said, Marie, the conventional chronology of the Civil War and indeed the broader picture of violence during the Irish Revolution does not, you know, what we assume, what we take as the broader picture of violence, and that conventional chronology doesn't neatly fit events in what was by then Northern Ireland, as you said. The first 6 months of 1922 saw intense periods of violence, and really I think what you have is a different type of civil war with different protagonists fought for slightly different reasons. And obviously there are connections and there are echoes, and you know, we can't understand what happens in the north without understand what's happening in the south. But we also need to, you know, understand it in its own merits as well. And you know, so there are a number of essays in the book that look specifically at events in what was by then Northern Ireland. And there were, you know, that delve into that violence of that first 6 months period. And one in particular, looking at one of the most infamous set of murders during that period, which was the McMahon murders in March 1922. Allegedly, with the involvement of Inspector Nixon of the RUC, this formed part of a pattern of assassination squads of B specials of the newly formed RUC, targeting individual or you know, small groups of Catholics in that kind of internecine sectarian warfare that characterised particularly events in Belfast in that period. And the essay by Lawrence Marley of NUIG is really interesting because it emphasises what was to me something that I'd never really thought about in relation to the McMahon killings, which was to emphasise Owen McMahon's relatively privileged status as one of the wealthiest Catholics in Belfast. And that was what was shocking about those murders, that this Owen McMahon, who lived in a Protestant part of Belfast, who lived in a fine house in a unionist district, he was deliberately targeted, and that was sending a message that any member of the minority community, no matter their station, no matter where they lived, they could be targeted. So kind of, you know, bringing out some of the class dynamics that we perhaps don't think about enough when we approach what's happening in Northern Ireland. There are other essays on grassroots peace building efforts, you know, looking at the Craig Collins Pact as maybe a formalization of what had been grassroots peace building efforts to try and keep a lid on the violence or tone it, you know, take it down a notch. And then also an essay looking at the kind of lived experience across the border. So in February 1922, there were attempts to sort of, you know, entrench the border, like physically entrench it literally by digging trenches, and local people in County Fermanagh fill in those trenches because they don't want to be cut off from what they see as their hinterland. They don't want to be impeded from crossing the border, going about their daily business as they would always have done. So that essay by Peter Leary is a really interesting example, I guess, of how ordinary people with their bodies, with their physicality, challenged, some of how the revolution was playing out, and how in particular partition was playing out. And the last thing I'd say is that I think what the book shows about the North in 1922 is that this is a really fluid period. The Northern Ireland Parliament has just opened six or 7 months previously. The stability, the long term, it still has the Boundary Commission hanging over it. It's by no means certain that Northern Ireland will in fact survive as an entity. although during 1922, the Northern Ireland Parliament formally declined to join in with the Free State. So you do have kind of steps towards the copper fastening of partition that we see finally in 1925 with the Boundary Commission. But in 1922, there's a lot of things still in play, and there's a lot of things that are still uncertain about how all this will pan out.
I think that focus on the border brings us neatly to a few points to conclude on. I suppose we always knew that the centenary of partition and the creation of the border would be one of the more delicate aspects of the decade of centenaries. In 2016, the Brexit vote really gave a renewed significance to the Irish border. And of course, more recently now, we have seen that the controversy over what would be the appropriate way to mark the centenary of the creation of Northern Ireland and partition. And that maybe gives, and we saw a bit of it last year as well with the controversy over whether or not to have an event to commemorate the Royal Irish Constabulary in the Republic. That brings us to, and maybe gives us a lead in to what we might expect, particularly, I suppose, in the Republic next year, as we have to deal with the legacy of what for the Republic is probably the most contentious aspect of the whole decade of centenaries, that of the Civil War. And I suppose, how do we, as historians and those who and authors of works reflecting and seeking to contextualize this period, what role do publications like these have? What role do historians have in I suppose, helping people to understand what happened, looking towards how we commemorate those contentious centenaries? Maybe a better way of putting it is a question which I recall Joe Lee putting to an audience at a seminar in Trinity back around 2016, and it really stuck in my head, and it was very simple, and I still don't know the answer to it. How do you commemorate a civil war? So any thoughts on that, maybe as a final wrap-up point? Well,
one of the options is not to. And there's also the option, I suppose, to be very understated. I'm not particularly worried about commemoration of the Civil War, unlike some others, precisely because there is nothing to celebrate. You don't celebrate civil wars. Todd Andrews wrote about that in his memoir. There's no glory in civil war, So what you would, I suppose, expect is some kind of a day that's earmarked for reconciliation and an acknowledgement of all of the lives that were lost as a result of the Civil War. There's not an awful lot more you can do. You're always going to have local dynamics and people who want to commemorate particular events at local level and perhaps particular atrocities or particular ambushes. That's completely understandable. And it should be driven by local communities and local historical groups and outreach and local authority libraries and so on that are engaging in very good work in relation to commemoration. What we're trying to do as historians, I suppose, is invoke the importance of complicating the narrative, which is a phrase that we've frequently used, and it's about the nuance and about appreciating the importance that the new archival material can make to complicating that narrative. But whatever work historians do, it can often, of course, be overtaken by big public controversies about the RIC or about partition. And we have to recognize that it's not all about history, of course. It's about current affairs. There is an ongoing sense of abandonment when it comes to the question of the border and partition and how you deal with that. And even in 1922, someone like Claire Healy was writing from the prison ship Argenta in Belfast, I'm looking for light or leading from Dublin, and I'm not getting it. Have we been abandoned? And, those questions play out now, obviously, in the modern era, the updated versions of them. And unionists have their perspective, of course, on what that period did. So, of course, commemorations are always liable to be hijacked. There are always going to be all sorts of different agendas. But the way to commemorate Civil War is to confront, in as so far as we can, the realities of what happened. And then to pick a time to remember those who were destroyed by it.
Yeah, I think I agree with what you've said, Diarmaid. And I think one point that I would add is that I think we get this phrase, there's a phrase that is used a lot when it comes to talking about commemoration, which is like narrative hospitality, and that this is a kind of, a faux even-handedness, right? Or this is what this phrase is intended to convey, that there's a faux even-handedness that avoids the sort of confrontation that you were just talking about. And that point, but I do think it's possible. I think we should accept that it is possible for people of good faith, well-informed people of good faith, to come to very different conclusions about some of the events that we were talking about, and about the appropriateness of various different commemorative efforts. And I think, so I think I would sort of just plea for listening to each other and for accepting that people can reach different conclusions based on their reading of the historical evidence. And I don't think we have to place all narratives of the past alongside each other. I think, we do want to make judgments as historians. That's what we do. We want to, use our professional training, use the new kinds of sources and the new archives that we've been talking about today to come to judgments and to assessments of explaining, why certain paths were taken, why certain decisions unfolded in the way that they did. But I don't know if I think that involves, I think that involves hard questions and confronting difficult periods and looking them straight in the face and understanding, well, why was it that the executions policy happened in the way that they did? And they were brutal, they were extrajudicial, they were, illegal in a kind of in a normative sense, but they were also kind of effective. They were brutally effective. If you look at the execution of Sean Hale, or the assassination of Sean Hales in December 1922, they were targeting Pádraig Ó Máille, who had voted for a public safety bill. They wounded him, they assassinated Sean Hales, and that was what triggered, the infamous December the 8th executions of Rory O'Connor, Liam Mellows, and Dick Barrett and Joe McKelvey. And that was a brutal act of state terror, but it worked. There were no more assassinations of pro-treaty Free State TDs, and I think we have to, and that's right thing, but it's acknowledging the effect that it had. And those are some of the difficult questions that I think we also have to look in square in the eye. And I think that, and I think there should be a space where multiple different narratives can be articulated, and that doesn't mean that they're all accepted or they're all given the same weight, but facilitating that space, I think, is something that historians can and should do.
Hilary, have you any observations on the book?
Yeah, well, I think one of the interesting things about the centenary and, when it's falling is actually what's happening politically now in contemporary times. And I think Brexit has opened up a whole lot of questions about, Ireland, the island of Ireland, our relationships with each other. And I think it kind of opens up the whole question of partition and what happened and why it happened and how it happened. And I think the more knowledge that people have, and it's great that there's all these publications, and I personally just love this period of history and love reading about it, because I think it is still an ongoing question. And that's the difficulty about it, is that it has never been a closed question. It has always been, I suppose, an aspiration. People talk about a united Ireland still, and the question of partition has never really been solved. And that makes the commemoration more difficult than it would be, say, if Brexit hadn't happened and all these questions, were more settled in terms of the Good Friday Agreement and how peace had been restored and everybody was reasonably happy with those relationships, and that could have been ongoing. But it is because of Brexit and because of contemporary issues and the fact that the centenary is falling at the same time. Now, I think it probably should be commemorated in a kind of an organic way. And that may seem like a trite kind of way of talking about it. But I think Diarmaid is right. I think that, you know, people in local communities, people in families, and a lot of families still have connections back to the Civil War and remember their ancestors who were involved. And, you know, all these books and different aspects, different narratives, like Caoimhe spoke about, that there's room for all of that. But I don't think we can escape the contemporary position and the centenary falling at the same time. And I think that's tricky.
Well, I think in terms of seeking to explain the 100 years ago and maybe even their enduring significance 100 years on, we've discussed three very fine books here. And just to remind our audience of the details of the books, Hilary's edited memoir of Maura Comerford's memoir has the, I think, we now know why, title of On Dangerous Ground, a memoir of the Irish Revolution. It's published by the Lilliput Press and will be available from early to mid-November, so plenty of time for the stocking fillers. Diarmaid's History of the Civil War, Between Two Hells, the Irish Civil War, is published by Profile Books. And if people get their book tokens for Christmas, then on the 1st of January 2022, the Royal Irish Academy will publish its compendium that Caoimhe has spoken about here today, Ireland 1922, Independence, Partition and Civil War. So I think wonderful books there for the Irish historian in your life for their Christmas stocking. I just want to conclude then by thanking our three speakers for a very engaging discussion, which I think could have gone on for until the 1st of January 2022 and beyond. I also want to thank our two partners today, the Dublin Book Festival and the Royal Dublin Society, the RDS's Library and Archive Service, as this event is a collaboration between the Dublin Book Festival and the RDS's Library Speaker Series. For more information on the RDS and its Library and Archive Service, and also its events like these, which online events, you can find all those details on the RDS's website, www.rds.ie.